Warsaw, and then he moved to the United States of America, relocating in Brooklyn, New York, in Crown Heights. He came over in 1940, and pretty soon started, well, there was a Chabad Lubavitch yeshiva in the old country, but he started again the yeshiva here in New York. Parenthetically, my grandfather was one of the first students in the yeshiva, although he did not grow up in a Chabad family. But when the previous Rebbe came over and they were recruiting guys for the yeshiva, so he was one of the guys that got poached in a good way. He got, it was like, it was the newest, greatest, yeshiva starting up. So always a startup kind of guy. So he joined. And I think he joined the yeshiva, I want to say in 1943, 1942. And some of you, I think, have met my grandfather in the past. Yeah, he was just here a few weeks ago for the bar mitzvah. Okay, so all that was parenthetical. 1950, the 10th day of Shvat in 1950. So the previous Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, passed away. He was a man who faced the communists. He was arrested in 1927 by the communists by the KGB and the communists on behalf of his efforts in running an underground network of Jewish education and Jewish experience, and they wanted to kill him. He was actually the documents have been released subsequently. His decree, the sentence, whatever, was for execution. Through intense pressure and of course spiritual intervention, I'm sure, it was commuted from execution to 10 years of harsh labor in Siberia, which was then commuted to 3 years, which was then commuted to being expelled from the country, which is essentially what happened. They said, all right, we're not going to send you into exile, but you can't be here anymore, and they basically essentially kicked him out. Again, all this was because of his Jewish activities. Nothing against the government per se, but against the way communists wanted to see Judaism or didn't want to see Judaism. So he was somebody who stood up to the communists and a true hero. He passed away in the winter of 1950, and his son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, became kind of the assumed successor. But it wasn't official until 1 year later, on the anniversary, the first anniversary of his father-in-law's passing, that the person who we would call the Rebbe or the Rebbe officially assumed the mantle of leadership of the Chabad Lubavitch movement. And in his first public discourse, which again was on the 10th day of Shvat in 1951, so exactly 1 year later, so the Rebbe, our Rebbe, spoke about the legacy of his father-in-law, and also about one of the last discourse of his father-in-law that was set to be published, or that was published for the day of his passing. Now, obviously, the publishers didn't know that was going to be the day of his passing. They published it for a Shabbat. Essentially, they printed it and had it ready to be put out in the synagogues, or the synagogue in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights, on that Sabbath, on that Shabbat, which was the 10th day of Shvat. And that morning, the 10th of Shvat in the morning, which was a Shabbat, the previous Rebbe passed away. So the next year, the Rebbe, in his first discourse, expounded upon the discourse that was released 1 year prior, written by his father-in-law, that would end up on the day of his passing. Does this make sense, the way I'm describing it? Okay, that discourse became one of the defining discourses of the Rebbe's leadership and his style of leadership, and it opens with the words from the Midrash, or actually it's quoting a verse from Song of Songs that says, Basi lagani achosi kala, which means I've come to my garden, my sister, my bride. And the Midrash says that what is this referring to? It's referring to the moment in history when God returned his divine presence back to the world. And it explains. Originally, God was revealed here on earth, but after various indiscretions by humankind, starting with Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil from the forbidden fruit, so what happened was the Shekhinah, the divine presence, elevated, ascended, level after level after level, up, 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 out of this physical reality. Through 7 generations of sin, the Midrash says, the divine presence ascended, and it was no longer found in a revealed way on earth. And then the Midrash continues to say, then there arose 7 righteous people, starting with Abraham, and they once again brought down the divine presence, each one a successive level, down, 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 until Moses. And the way it's described in the Midrash, it says Moses was the 7th, and Kol HaShaviyin Chavivin, all 7. All 7s are beloved. 7 is a lucky number. 7 is a beloved number. So Moses was the 7th, and it was Moses who facilitated obviously God brought it about, but facilitated the exodus from Egypt and the subsequent giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, which constituted revelation at Sinai, and that brought back heaven down to earth in a revealed way once again. And so that's the meaning, that's the deeper meaning of the verse in Song of Songs, I have come back to my garden, my sister, my bride. It's understood in this way. It's God speaking to humankind saying, I've come back. I've returned to my garden. This was the opening of the final discourse of the previous Rabbi. Again, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who passed away 70 years ago this week. Tuesday night and Wednesday is the 70th anniversary of his passing. And it's also the first discourse of our Rebbe, his son-in-law, his successor. And the way it's described in both of these discourses, this concept, is number one, and this is something that was a theme throughout our Rebbe's leadership, is that the world is first and foremost a garden. No matter what it looks like on the outside, there's beauty inside. You know, anyone a gardener here? Any gardeners here? Yes? Yes? So a garden very quickly can turn into a bit of a jungle, right? It can be overgrown, it can look, I don't know. I'm not a gardener, but I'm spitballing here. Huh? Yeah, weeds, there you go. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah, it can quickly be overrun by weeds and other things that you don't necessarily want. So when you are a gardener, you have to be very careful. You have to be on top of it to make sure that what you want is growing, how you grow it, where you grow it, right? That what you want is there, and what you don't want is not there. But if you don't know that there's potential for a garden, what are you going to do? You might just throw your garbage there because you think it's a dump. Yeah? Right? But if you know it's a garden, so even if it doesn't look in tip-top shape yet, you might be inspired to cultivate, to do some weeding, to do some planting, and to make it beautiful. So first and foremost, the lesson of this verse in the Midrash and the discourse is the world is a garden. And the Rebbe said that we live in a world that looks chaotic, but we have to know that at its core, there's a lot of potential. It's beautiful. God wants us to be the gardeners. So if it looks out of control, it doesn't mean that God made a mistake or God messed up. You know what it means? We have to do a better job tending to this garden. There's so much beauty and so much potential there. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two. The Rebbe said, and the Rebbe was the 7th of the Chabad Rebbes, and he said, look, it says about Moses that all 7s are precious and dear. So the Rebbe said, we may not have asked for it. We may not have volunteered for this, but we're the 7th. So therefore we have a responsibility to make this world a better place and to bring God's presence down to earth. In other words, make the world a holy place, a beautiful place, a home for God. And that was the entire purpose and mission that was clear in the Rebbe's leadership in the Chabad movement, and which then became throughout the whole Chabad movement, which is that we look at the world as a place of inner beauty, like a garden, and the goal is not just to make the garden look beautiful, but to bring heaven back down to earth and to make this world a home for God. Now, the opening discourse of the Rebbe's leadership was phenomenal. It's amazing, it's grand, it sets out a vision and a focus of big ideas. transforming the world into a divine abode it's like a big deal. In middle of the discourse, chapter 6 of the discourse, the Rebbe almost shifts gears a little bit, and he talks about the legacy of the Rebbes that came before him. So this is the excerpt that I pulled right here in the handout. So this is, I apologize about the printing. My computer wasn't working to print for some reason, and it's got printed from like a phone, from a mobile app, so it printed very small. I guess phones think that everything should be small. You just hold it close. So we'll have to hold this like a device. All right, you ready? Don't mind me. I'm just reading. Okay. So this is, again, it's the supplementary text of chapter 9 of our text, but it's chapter 6 of the Rebbe's original discourse this week in 1951. Okay, you ready? Remember, this is the middle of a discussion about like the world and purpose and God and beauty and seventh and all this stuff. Okay. Whatever was demanded of us by the Rebbe of blessed memory, and here he's talking about his father-in-law, and by all of the Rebbeim, all of the previous Rebbes, Chabad Rebbes, they demanded of themselves. In other words, they didn't just talk the talk, they also walked the walk. If they said that we needed to do it, they themselves lived by example. This recalls the sage's interpretation of the verse, referring to God. He tells his words to Yaakov, his statutes and ordinances to Yisrael. The sages comment, that which he does, he tells the Jewish people to do and observe. So this is a very important point. I don't want it to get lost in a parenthetical way, although it's somewhat parenthetical in this discussion, but let me just explain what he's saying. There is a midrashic interpretation of the verse that says, Magid devarav liYaakov, chukav mishpatav liYisrael. He tells his words to Jacob, his statutes and ordinances to Israel. That's what the verse says. The sages say, you know what it means? That every mitzvah, every commandment in Torah is not just something that God says that we should do. These are values that God himself, on some level, also performs. And it's because these are dear values to God, that's why he gives it to us. Are you with me on this? It's not just that God says, you know what? I think y'all should be doing this. I'm not doing it, but I think you should be doing it. It's not how it works. It's not what a mitzvah is. Right? Because it's dear and beloved to God, whatever value it is, therefore God wants us to share in that value. So God is compassionate. He wants us to be compassionate. God takes care of those who need help. The Torah tells us God visits the sick. He observes the Sabbath first and foremost. He rested on the seventh day. Boom, exactly. Right? So that which is dear to him, the values that are, by the way, speaking of the Sabbath, we have a new course that we just started last week called Judaism's Gifts to the World. And we speak about ideas, Jewish ideas, that went mainstream, that went viral, so to speak. Ideas that are so maybe obvious to us today as moral human beings, but that originate exclusively in Torah, in Jewish ideas, and the route by which they went from very specific and particular Jewish ideas to universal ideas is sometimes absolutely breathtaking and incredible. And each of these values begins in a way that's, not understood by others and even kind of dismissed by the larger world and other societies. One of them, which we'll discuss, we have a whole session on this, I think it's maybe lesson 5 of this new course, is all about Shabbat. And how the notion of a non-7-day work week, right, on a very basic labor law level, right, on a human level, the fact that we don't live in a society where, I feel like we almost do, but okay, theoretically we live in a society before cell phones, where we don't or didn't work, all the time, 24/7, that itself is a Jewish value. And where does a Jewish value come from? It's a divine value. Right? Where do the Torah values come from? It comes from God. So the values that are dear to God, he wants to share with us. So every mitzvah, it's a paradigm shift in understanding what a mitzvah is. A mitzvah is not just a good deed, although it is. It's a divine commandment. But it's not just a commandment that God says, you know what? You should be doing this. No, these are things that God is on some level already observing or holding dear, and God says, I want you to have an optimized existence. And if it's good for me, it's going to be good for you. Now, you may be wondering, well, how does every mitzvah translate? How does God, eat matzah on Passover? Good question. So for that, you got to study a little bit of Kabbalah, which we're here doing, right? And understand what it means mystically, spiritually, and then understand the spiritual analog, the divine analog to the mitzvah that we have. So we may have a physical manifestation of that spiritual concept, but the spiritual truth originates in God. That's again a parenthetical explanation. But getting back to this idea, what the Rabbi is saying in chapter 6 of his first discourse, officially assuming the mantle of leadership of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, is just as it is with God, that God only shares the things that He's already doing on some level. So too, fourth paragraph, let me round that up. So too, that which He commands the Jewish people to do, He Himself does. So the mitzvot that are given, God does. Fifth paragraph, the same is true regarding the conduct of our mentors, the Rabbeim, the Chabad Rebbes. Whatever they demanded of their Hasidim, of their disciples and followers, they themselves fulfilled as well. So when a Rebbe would come out with a call and say, this is what we need to focus on or whatever, they were clearly already doing that, or that's not something that was simply a call to action for others. It was a call to action or expressing already what they themselves were doing. The reason that they revealed to us that they too perform these things was in order to make it easier for us to perform them, which tells us something, which tells us something fantastic. That the Rebbes told us, or there are stories from the Rebbes about certain things that they made a call for us to do, and that makes it easier for us to do, knowing that they were on that same page. Accordingly, and here's the punchline, accordingly, there are many stories regarding the love of a fellow Jew involving each of the Rebbeim. The mitzvah to love our fellow as ourselves. Right? The mitzvah to love. The value to care about someone else. And here it's phrased as the mitzvah to love a fellow Jew, but it's really to love a fellow human being. Right? It's just in a Jewish communal context, that's the most direct implication of it or application of it. But the mitzvah is a broader mitzvah. So the point is that the call to love another person was reflected in the behavior and the conduct of the Chabad Rebbes in a powerful way. They modeled this love. Again, understand this. The reason why we're studying this, number one, it's very timely because it's the anniversary this week of the previous Rebbe's passing and the Rebbe's assumption of the mantle of leadership, which is where this excerpt is coming from, but also because our entire text in chapter 9 that we're going to study today is all about the extent to which we have to care about someone else. And if you're wondering how is it possible to really care about someone else, here are some stories that can inspire us, stories of the Chabad Rebbes about how they cared about others that can inspire us to care about someone else as well. So let's jump right in. And he goes through each of his predecessors. The Alter Rebbe, for example, the founder of Chabad, the author of Tanya, once interrupted his prayers in order to go and chop wood, cook a soup, and feed it to a woman who had just given birth, because there was no one else to do it. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but I can tell you the rest of the story. I feel like Paul Harvey here. You want to hear the rest of the story? This wasn't just any regular day. This was Yom Kippur. And there he was, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. It's a fast day. It's a holy day. People try to wear white. You pray the whole day. Try to stand on your feet the whole day like the angels. No eating and drinking, right? Again, it's a fast day. And here he was, the spiritual leader of the community. And the story goes, he was in synagogue with his talit on, prayer shawl on. And he takes it off and he walks out of the synagogue. And he goes to the forest. Now, understand this. Yom Kippur is like the Sabbath. There's no chopping wood. There's no making fire. There's no cooking. All of that is off the table. He goes, he gets an axe, he chops wood, he makes a fire, and he cooks soup for this woman. Why? Because she had just given birth. There was no one at home, and she was in. Her life was it was health related, and when it comes to health, life and death. So of course you violate pretty much any other mitzvah, any other commandment, including Shabbat, including Yom Kippur, in order to protect the life, and that's what he was doing. But he did it himself. He did it himself. Although the Rebbe says there was no one else to do it, if he would have asked someone to do it, I'm sure people would have done it. But the point was, he himself did this. And imagine this. How easy would it have been for him to say to himself, look, I'm the spiritual leader of the congregation, right? My job is to be here in the congregation. Let me send Yankel. Yeah, Yankel, we always say Yankel for any random name. It's always Yankel. Let's send Yankel, the schlepper. Let's send him. Let him do it. It's a mitzvah. We'll give it, and you know what? We'll couch it. Yankel, come here. I have a big mitzvah for you to do. This is like the biggest mitzvah. You're going to go, take an axe, and chop wood, and make a soup, and cook soup for this, make a fire, cook soup for this woman. It's going to be such a mitzvah. Rabbi, am I allowed to do it? Not only are you allowed to do it, it's a mitzvah today. It's a mitzvah to help her strength and preserve her life. It's a huge mitzvah, and I want to give you the honor of doing it. In the meantime, I'm going to continue leading the services and give spiritual insights. You should go ahead and do it. How easy would that have been for him to do? And how often are important tasks, right, delegated by big leaders because they have big things to do? The Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, one of the greatest spiritual leaders, one of the greatest mystics of all time, the author of perhaps, arguably, the greatest Jewish spiritual handbook, i.e., when I say handbook, I don't mean spiritual guides of all time, the book of Tanya. And here the Alter Rebbe himself leaves synagogue on the morning of Yom Kippur to chop wood, make a fire, and cook soup. Unheard of. This is what it means to care about someone else, where you care so much about someone else that you're not even thinking about who else can do it. Because when you're filled with care and with love, with empathy, with concern, etc., whatever the entire suite of emotions is, and it is a suite, S-U-I-T-E, maybe also S-W-E-T, who knows, right? But when you're filled with that entire spectrum of emotions, you yourself are going to do it. You're not going to give it off, hand it off to someone else. Yankel will have to find his own mitzvah. So that's a story about Ahavas Yisrael, about loving your fellow from the Alter Rebbe. Here we go. Next, the second Rebbe. Likewise, at Yechidus. Yechidus is like a one-on-one soul meeting that a disciple has with a spiritual master, that a chassid would have with a Rebbe. So likewise, at Yechidus, with the Mittler Rebbe, with the second Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber, a certain young man once lamented about those things that young men lament about. Okay, he's being a little bit vague here, but he was lamenting about a certain challenge that he had. Spiritual challenge. The Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe, uncovered his forearm and said, "Observe how my skin clings to my bones, and all of this is from your sins of youth." He rolled up his sleeve and he showed him how his own flesh was somehow, skin clings to my bones. I don't know. Somehow the skin was folded or whatever, and he says, you know why? It's the pain of what you're doing, of what you're involved in, called sins of youth. It's harming me. Again, this shows the empathy, the connection that he had with this young man. Next, he then explains, the stupendous spiritual nature of the Mittler Rebbe, of the aforementioned second Rebbe, needs no describing by any standards, and all the more so in comparison to those who are subject to such things, i.e., to the activities that this young man was involved in. Nevertheless, his spiritual bond with them was so strong that their unsatisfactory spiritual state affected his physical health to the point that his skin shriveled and clung to his bones. In other words, he was so connected, and he cared so much about the spiritual state of those that were connected with him, that he was physically affected by the actions that they were doing, including the actions of this young man. Okay, next. You with me so far in these two stories? Yes? I have to tell you. I think I mentioned it before, but I want to emphasize it. This is coming in the middle of a discourse with the Rabbi in his first inaugural address, formal address upon accepting the leadership of the Chabad movement. This is in the middle of a discussion about big ideas and cosmic ideas and God and garden and world and seven and bringing heaven down to earth, all this stuff. Chapter 6, he's speaking about loving another person, being there for them. It's a little bit out of left field, but as we'll soon see, it speaks to the entire theme. Okay, next, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rabbi, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, once went out of his way before prayers in order to lend money to a very simple person who was in need. So here's the story. The story goes that he was walking on his way to synagogue, and a fellow, we'll call him Yankel, approaches him and says to him, the truth is, the way the stories are recorded in full, there may be a name associated with this fellow. It might be known who this was. Anyway, so this fellow approached him and says, Rabbi, I need some money. He was a businessman, so he would buy merchandise from wholesale and then sell it retail. Buy low, sell high. It's a classic formula, right? So he was looking to get to the market, to the wholesale marketplace early in the morning when the good merchandise is there and you can have your pick of the stuff. But he needed money. He needed money to purchase. You got to have money. You got to have some capital to get your stuff to then turn around and sell and then profit. So he didn't have any money. So he went to the third Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and he said to him, "Can I borrow some money? I'll pay you back once I sell stuff and I make a profit. I'll pay you back what you gave me." So he said to him, "Look, I'm on my way to synagogue for prayers. So after prayers, come to me. After the service, come to me, and I'll give you money then." Fine. So he goes to the synagogue. The Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe does, the third Rebbe, and he's there, getting ready for prayers, and he has his talit folded over his shoulder. Right? He hasn't put it on yet, but it's over his shoulder. He's kind of getting ready for the prayers. And he thinks to himself, wait a second. Again, Yankel, we'll call him Yankel. Yankel is trying to get to the marketplace early. And by the time I end prayers, it's not going to be early anymore. And if I give him the money, then what's going to happen? So he'll go to the marketplace. Maybe there won't be any merchandise left, or maybe it won't be such good merchandise left. And he'll purchase whatever's there, and he's gonna miss out on an opportunity. So he takes off his talent from his shoulder, and he runs home, gets the money, and runs to the marketplace to find this guy, and he lends him the money. The postscript of the story is that at that point, his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, who had passed away by then, suddenly came to him in a vision. And he said to him, and he would experience visions and teachings from his grandfather even after his grandfather's passing. But for a while they had stopped. But now, the moment he gave this man the money, or shortly thereafter, his grandfather came to him in a vision. And he said to him, you should know that when you put someone else before yourself, that opens up all the channels, all the gates, all the channels above. Everything is open when we put someone else before ourselves. So as long as your position was, first I'm going to pray and take care of what I want to do, and then afterwards I'll give you the money that you need and take care of your needs. As long as that's the situation, the heavenly gates aren't as open. Because what it means is your ego, or you're putting yourself before someone else. But when you put the other before yourself, that opens up all the gates. Let's continue. Then there is the story of the fourth Rebbe, of how the Rebbe Marash, Rabbi Shmuel, once traveled from a healing spa to Paris, solely for the purpose of meeting with a young man, to whom he said, "Young man, forbidden wine stupefies the mind and heart. Become a practicing Jew." That's what he tells him. So here's the story. Again, a lot of these stories we know from other books, from other memoirs. So here's a story. The Rebbe Marash, Rabbi Shmuel, was physically, he had a lot of physical ailments, and so he needed to be in healing places of healing. So he was in a healing spa, but he traveled all the way from, this is going to be Eastern Europe or Russia, all the way to Paris. And we know which hotel it was because the stories tell us. The Hotel Alexandria. He goes to the Hotel Alexandria, which was a casino hotel in Paris, and he goes to the casino floor, and he sits down to a fellow there at the casino. I don't know which table he was at. I don't know what he was playing, or if he was at the bar or whatever it was. But on the casino floor, he goes, sits down to this fellow, and he says the following words to him. He said, what we just read. Young man, I guess he was drinking, right? Forbidden wine, not kosher wine, makes the mind and heart, we're stupefied, but it makes it dulled, insensitive. And he says, become a practicing Jew. And he walks out, and he goes up to his hotel room, and this young man eventually follows him up to his room, and he has a spiritual awakening, and he had a change of heart and soul and spirit, and he went back to where he needed to be. So that's the story of how this great Rebbe traveled all the way to Paris for one person. Next. Oh, here we go. The young man returned home and found no rest until he returned to the Rebbe Marash and repented. Next. Next page. Eventually he became the head of a God-fearing and observant family. Let's continue. It was well known that time was extremely precious to the Rebbe Marash, to the extent that even his recital of Maimarim of discourses was brief. There were times when at 8 a.m. he had already concluded his prayers, which in the Hasidic tradition is not usually the case, because usually prayers are extended. Nonetheless, he traveled to a distant city and stayed there a considerable amount of time for the sake of one young man. All right, so that's again the story of the fourth Rebbe. Now the fifth Rebbe. When the Rebbe Rashab, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber, first became Rebbe, he was about to embark on a journey to Moscow because of a new anti-Semitic decree which he sought to nullify. His older brother, Rabbi Zalman Aaron, known by his acronym as the Razah, said to him, "Time is very precious to you, and you do not speak Russian well." I guess he spoke Yiddish, was his language of choice. The Razah was a linguist. Oh, so he was saying that the brother was saying maybe he should go. "You also have to make the necessary arrangements. I will travel to take care of this matter, and will follow your instructions." However, the Rebbe Rashab did not agree. He went himself and was successful. So again, that's a story about how the fifth Rebbe was dedicated himself to ensure that the needs of others was taken care of, and he did not delegate to others. Next, similarly, there are many stories of how the Rebbe, a blessed memory, and here the Rebbe is referring to his father-in-law who had just passed away a year prior, went out of his way to do material and spiritual favors even to individuals. He selflessly set himself aside in order to do so, setting aside not only his physicality, his own physical needs, but also his spirituality, i.e. his spiritual needs, even though the person to whom he was benevolent was not only not in the category of his equal in Torah mitzvot, but did not compare to him at all. And that is an excerpt from chapter 6 of that original discourse. And what's the moral of the stories? The moral of the stories is how when the Rebbes encouraged us to care about someone else, it wasn't something that they preached but did not practice. They practiced. They went out of their way, not only on a communal level, although one of the stories was a communal decree, but on an individual level. Themselves, putting themselves out in the field, out on the line, and there are countless stories. These are just one from each of the Rebbes, stories about putting themselves out for the sake of individuals. Sandrine, is the Hotel Alexandria still there? In Paris? You're our Paris rep.
Usually I stay with Pavilion, so I don't know.
So you don't hit the... Listen, you know what? If you did hit the casino, we wouldn't have... There would be no judgment. Have to research if it's still there. We could probably Google it and see if it's still there. Okay. Yeah, so all of this is to highlight a central idea. And that is that in his first discourse, or at the first Fabrengen, at the first gathering, where the Rebbe officially took on the leadership of the Chabad movement, he said in America there's a custom that when something big happens or when something new happens, you have to make a statement. Right? You have to make a statement. Give a statement to the press or whatever. So he says, so in fitting with the American tradition, the Rabbi said this in Yiddish, in the whole thing in Yiddish, in fitting with the American tradition, I'll make a statement. This was the Rebbe's statement to a small group packed in the synagogue in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights. He says, what's the statement? There are three loves. The love of God, the love of Torah, and the love of a fellow human being. And the reality is that it's the love, that you can't love one without the other. If you love God and you love Torah, you have to love the human being. You can't just say, I love God and I love Torah and mitzvot, but I can't stand that guy. Right? Then you don't really love God and you don't love Torah. You can't separate one love from the other. The three loves are intertwined. And so in this first discourse, as the Rebbe speaks about all these lofty ideas, bringing heaven down to earth, returning God's presence down to the physical plane, seventh generation, all this stuff, what can't be lost, and what I think was the point of this chapter 6 of this original discourse, what can't be lost is, do you care about someone else and how they're doing? Do we care about how someone else is feeling? One of my favorite biblical stories is the story of Joseph. Why? Because it's such a great story of somebody who gets really cast down to the ground and who's able to not get down and not get depressed and not get broken, but is able to lift themselves up and accomplish great things. It's an incredibly inspiring story. But what's the key to his getting out of jail? When he was thrown in jail, in prison, for a crime he didn't commit, what was the key to him getting out? He was interpreting the dream of the butler and the baker. Remember? The candlestick maker was not present. It was only the butler and the baker. Okay, and he interprets the dream of the butler that he'll get out of prison. The baker, he said, is going to get executed. And when the butler gets out, eventually he tells Pharaoh, there's a guy, when Pharaoh has dreams, there's a guy who interprets dreams, Joseph, and Joseph gets pulled out. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh likes him, and the rest is history. But how does that story begin with him interpreting the dreams of the butler and the baker? How did he know they had dreams? The Torah tells us that they were in prison, and one morning, Joseph goes over to the butler and the baker and he says, Madua penechem ro'im hayom. Why do your faces look sad today? And then they said, we had dreams and we don't know what they mean. And Joseph said, tell them to me. And he interprets them, and again, the rest is history. But it all begins with Joseph not only noticing their mood, being a little bit downcast, but asking them and listening to what they said. First of all, as the Rebbe pointed out in talking about this story, first of all, they're all in prison. And this is ancient Egypt. I'm sure it wasn't like a nice place. It wasn't a nice facility. It was probably terrible. Can you imagine ancient Egypt?
It's probably the same today. Right.
We're in Egypt. I don't know, but I can imagine it's not a nice place to be. So imagine you're there with two other guys, and they don't look happy. What would you assume? Yeah, they're not happy because they're in prison, right? There's an obvious reason why they're unhappy. So would you even ask, why do you look sad today? It's like, yeah, I get it. We're all depressed. We're all sad. We're all not feeling it. But he was so sensitive, so attentive, that he was able to see that they looked even sadder today than yesterday. So his question was, why do you look not just sad, but even more sad? And he didn't just say, well, they look sad, I'm also sad. I don't care about them. I have my own stuff to worry about. I should care about someone else's mood. Do you know what happened to me? I was sold by my brothers. I fought to work myself up, and then I got framed by my master's wife. This is ridiculous. He He could have been in that space and turned his back, closed his heart off to the way anyone else felt. Because why should he care about anyone else? Everyone else has harmed him his whole life. Everyone who he's ever gotten close to has hurt him. So what does a person do who's been repeatedly hurt? Typically, close off, unfeeling, uncaring about anyone else. It would be very easy for Joseph to be completely cold. But he's not. He's sensitive. He's caring. He's attentive. And he's so caring that he asks them, how are you feeling? Why the long face? Why do you look sad? Tell me, how can I help? It's unheard of. It's unheard of. There is no figure, there's no person in Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, that cries as many times as Joseph. In the story of Joseph that spans 3 or 4 Torah portions, Joseph is said to have cried a number of times. He cried when his brothers first came to him. He cried when Benjamin came down. He cried when he was reunited. He cried when he revealed himself to his brothers. He cried when he was reunited with I said Benjamin already, but when he was reunited post revealing his identity, when he hugs Benjamin, he cries. He cries when he's reunited with his father, which indicates a sensitivity of heart. How easy is it for somebody who's been hurt to not cry anymore? The heart doesn't feel, and the eyes don't produce tears. It's a normal human reaction to deep trauma, to not be able to cry. And here we have somebody who was sensitive, who never lost his sensitivity and his empathy to someone else. So to the butler and baker, who were guilty of whatever crimes they were guilty of, he has empathy, and he cares about them. Why do you look sad today? Tell me, unburden yourself, tell me what's going on, and I can try to help. This is Joseph. This is what it means to really feel for someone else, to really care for someone else. So with this in mind, let's jump into chapter 9 of our discourse. Please take and pass. Chapter 9. Again, this is the numbering in this text is very Super Bowl-esque. It's chapter IX. I feel like each chapter should be paired with a Super Bowl. Super Bowl 9 was, I don't know who. It's been a few years. What I was just going to ask, what are we? It's 50, definitely 50 something. I know my Steelers won 50, I think, in Detroit. But what are we up to? 50?
J-Lo. We're at the J-Lo.
We're at the J-Lo. Huh?
I thought you knew all this stuff.
54 is it? 50. Are you sure?
Or it's 59.
No, IV.
IV is a 4.
No, IV. 54.
It's just 54?
Just 54?
So maybe the Steelers didn't win 50. They didn't win 4 years ago. All right. Whatever. Upon further review. Okay. Let's jump back in. Chapter 9. So we're talking here about not feeling for someone else. Not feeling for someone's, for what's going on with someone. And we said it all stems from ego. When a person is filled with their own self, when a person is arrogant, is self-centered, a person is inflated within, puffed up with hot air, right, with their own ego, it becomes very difficult to have space or to create space for another human being. And we said at the end of the previous chapter, chapter 8, we said last week, that this, first of all, this is the condition of the klipa, of the evil of midya. Midya means people are their own little islands and they don't feel for each other, they don't care about the other. And what he said at the end of chapter 8 is, what happens is, it could be that people will tear down what other people build, and will discredit what other people say just because the other person said it. It's not because of what they said, and it's not even because of what I feel about the idea. It's because I can't allow them to have their idea remain unchallenged. So if they said something, I have to knock it down. I have to disagree. There's the synagogue I go to, the synagogue I used to go to, and the synagogue I would never step foot into, right? Per the joke of last week of the guy who creates 3 synagogues on the desert island by himself, right? It's all about feeling the need to discount someone else, which again is coming from ego. A division of hearts, ego. People can't tolerate each other and become opponents. Chapter 9. This yeshus, this ego, is also the cause of the hatred which springs up between one man and his fellow for no reason, merely because one cannot tolerate his fellow and views him negatively, despising and scorning even the good within him. Right? It could be to the point where the other person has good, is doing good things, but a person can't even tolerate the good of the other because of their own ego that gets in the way. He will deprecate and scorn his friend's divine service and his fulfillment of Torah and mitzvot. In other words, the person will discount and say that that person spiritually is worthless or not doing the right thing or whatever it is going to discount, deprecate, and scorn the good things that the other person does, simply because the ego doesn't allow for that person to give respect to the other. Although his fellow has never harmed him, and on his part, he has no plan to actually harm his fellow, still his heart is not completely with him, and for no reason whatsoever. It's not an intellectual idea, it's an emotional idea, it's an ego idea. When I say idea, it's an ego thing. This is alluded to in the verse. This is a verse from Isaiah, which says, your brothers who hate you have said, etc. ... One's own brothers even become one's enemies. It says, your brothers who hate you. It means that a brother can become an enemy. He's lamenting this. He's not saying it's a good thing. He's saying how terrible it is that a brother can become an enemy. The Hebrew word for brother, ach is Hebrew for brother, means to join. Ach means brother, but it also means to combine 2 things together. A union stronger than merely the absence of anything separating one from the other. So the word ach, or achim, brother or brothers, means that you have a positive catalyst for connection, not just the absence of a factor that would split people apart, but you actually have some glue there to bring people together. Hence the verse refers to brothers, implying a state of being bound and connected, and yet, even though they're connected, they are enemies without reason, merely because they cannot tolerate each other. This is the danger, he's saying, the danger of the ego, of yeshus, of midjan. The danger of ego is such that even when there are reasons to connect, you're dealing with brothers. You have people that have things in common. It's not that there's nothing in common. There's a lot in common, and a lot of good things in common. The two are fighting simply because the egos are butting heads. The egos are getting in the way. Such a person is not happy in his fellow's peace and good fortune. This is hard to read, but it's true, and I mentioned this last week. Such a person is not happy in his fellow's peace and good fortune. When the other guy is at peace and things are going well, this person is not happy. On the contrary, he secretly rejoices at the other's suffering, heaven forbid. Or at the very least, he's not troubled by the other person's misfortunes. So there's different levels in which this can be manifest. And again, this is only something that a person knows in their heart of hearts. This is not something no one can prove that person A secretly rejoiced at person B's misfortunes. No one can prove it. But person A knows how they felt when they heard about something negative that happened to person B. Did you cry with them or for them? Or was some part of you on some level secretly rejoicing because you have a beef with them? Maybe even an irrational beef with them. That's the danger. That's the evil of midjan, which is basically synonymous with ego. That's the danger of ego. By the way, our usual disclaimer, not all ego is evil. Ego is good. Sometimes you need ego. Self-confidence. You need ego for the sake of having a backbone, of standing up for what you believe in. Ego is good for many things. But ego can be very destructive if the ego doesn't allow the person, doesn't speak for myself, right? If the ego doesn't allow me to connect with somebody else, and even more so, moreover, pushes me away from the other, or causes me to feel that the other is my competition, even though I don't need to look at the person as my competition at all, right? But if the ego makes me feel like we're in some sort of battle against each other, then the ego is definitely negative. That's an evil form of ego. That's the midyan ego. That's the yeshus, that's the ego that is driving people apart. It's driving people apart to the point they don't feel good for each other's joy. They don't feel bad for the other person's sorrow. They feel bad when the other person has good things, and they feel good, again, God forbid, when the other person experiences bad things. All right, let's continue. In truth, make sense? Yes? I mean, it doesn't, but what I mean it doesn't. It shouldn't be like this, but we can all relate. In truth, one should feel more anguish. Look what he says here. This is so beautiful. One should feel more anguish at someone else's suffering than at one's own heaven forfend. In other words, a person, you and I should feel more pain when the other person is in pain than even when we ourselves are in pain, God forbid. Why? Because in one's own case, one can always explain that one deserves suffering because of one's misdeeds. For oneself, one can say, you know why I'm going through this difficulty? It's because I didn't do such and such, or I did do such and such. A person can kind of, for themselves, own their actions and say the consequences that I'm getting may be a result of my own indiscretions, and therefore let me improve it and fix it, but at least I understand why it's happening because it's a wake-up call for me to do something better. That's something that one can do for oneself, but never for someone else. You can never make that account, that cheshbon, that calculation for someone else and say, you know why they're suffering? It's because they didn't do what they needed to do. That's never kosher. That's never okay. So for one to self-reflect and say, this didn't work out the way I wanted to, or this negative energy is coming to me. Maybe it's because of something that I've done. So let me look inside and fix something. That's perfectly kosher. That's introspection. That's okay. But to do that to someone else, to say, hey Yankel, you're going through difficulty. I think it's because you've messed up. And you deserve it. Makes sense that it's happening to you, Yankel. Yeah? If I was God, I would be doing the same thing to you. That's not okay. That's not kosher. Sometimes this line, it sounds maybe obvious the way I'm framing it now, but it's not so obvious. Because you have examples where, let's say, natural disasters happen, and people get on the media and say, quoting like religious things, and say, the reason this happened is because of the people are not doing what they need to be doing. Yeah, you ever hear that? Yeah. Yeah, New Orleans happens, Katrina happened because everything going on over there. Based on what we just said, kosher or not kosher? Not kosher. You can talk about yourself, and you can blame yourself, although blame is not healthy. You can self-reflect and improve yourself with the hope that that's going to have a positive result. That's kosher. But to blame someone else for their own suffering, to say, I know why it happened to you, it's because of X, Y, and Z, and to point a finger at someone else, that's just kicking someone while they're down. That's not kosher. Again, it sounds obvious, but people do it all the time. Without even necessarily intending to be malicious. It's done all the time. Something happens bad, and the first thought is, well, I wonder what they did. And it's not a kosher attitude. For oneself, it's okay, again, within a certain boundary. But for someone else, it's off the table. I'm going to start that paragraph again. This is such a critical idea. Page 18, middle paragraph. In truth, one should feel more anguish at someone else's suffering than at one's own, heaven forfend. In one's own case, one can always explain that one deserves suffering because of one's misdeeds. As our sages declared, this is coming from the Talmud, if one sees that suffering is coming upon him, he should examine his deeds. In other words, if somebody is getting, right, if the universe, if we want to speak in like New Agey term, if the universe is throwing you negative energy, then one should look at what energy are they putting out there in the world, right? What are they doing? What are their deeds like? And try to tweak so that things will be, no guarantee, but it's a positive, it's a good experience. Not a good experience for the suffering, but it's a helpful response in the face of suffering to look inside and to ask the question, what can I be doing differently? And if one honestly searches back inside, the reason will surely be found. And if no reason can be found, our sages explain that the suffering results from one's failure to study Torah. Realizing the cause, one will not feel anguish, quite the contrary. Since suffering rectifies the soul, he will accept it with love. Again, this itself is a very high level of relating to one's own suffering. It's not an easy response, but at least it could be positive for oneself. Again, if somebody is experiencing challenges, so they should look within, put a mirror up, look inside, and say, okay, what is it that I can tweak? What am I not doing correctly? Or like when it comes to Torah, can I be studying more Torah? And if I can't, or either way, a person should say to themselves, either way, whatever pain I'm going through, it should be somehow a tikkun, a repair, a correction for whatever it is that needed correction. There's an old phrase that's said in many a Jewish home, and some of you may have heard this before, that when somebody in the family drops a plate and it breaks, what do you say?
Score.
You say, Mazel Tov. It should be a kapara. Kapara. It should be an atonement, so to speak. Like whatever negative needed to happen, that should be it. Right? So it should be. So a person can feel about oneself. If somebody's going through a hard time, they should look inside, look within. What do I need to tweak? What do I need to be doing more of? What should I be doing less of? And either way, it's a tikkun, it's a repair, it's a kapara, it's an atonement for whatever it is that needs to be fixed. But that's all with regards to oneself. However, these assumptions cannot be made concerning another suffering. This is why the same formula that holds for oneself cannot be applied to someone else. And a person might say, well, if it's true for me, it should be true for the other person. In other words, if my suffering, if my challenge is coming to me because of my shortcomings, so for sure, or so likewise, Yankel sitting next to me, if he's going through a hard time, I should tell him, Yankel, you should really look inside and figure out what your deal is. That seems to be a logical application of this truth for me, and yet it's not. However, these assumptions cannot be made concerning another suffering. One must assume that the other person is good in every respect. Look at this. Are you with me on this? But we know Yankel. There's no way.
He's at that casino table all the time.
All the time. Hotel Alexandria. Dude's going back and forth to Paris like nobody's business.
He's been in Vegas too.
But yeah, and what happens in Vegas stays with Yankel. But here's the point. This is a radically positive perspective on another person. One must assume, I'm reading the second sentence again in the last paragraph, one must assume that the other person is good in every respect. One should not view others in terms of one's own experience. For one must judge every man, every person positively and firmly believe he is surely better than oneself. This is radical stuff. Because typically we go the other way. Me, I'm justified in all my shortcomings. Yankel, terrible guy. Although we love Yankel.
There is a Yankel Rosenthal. Be careful who you talk about.
There are so many Yankels out there. And all Yankels, you should do a disclaimer, as like they do in movies, any depiction of Yankel is not based on any actual character or whatever. This is a fictional Yankel. There are different Yankels. There's the Yankel, the simple, there's Yankel the tzaddik, there's Yankel, now this guy, the sufferer, the guy who's going through some challenges.
Is that kind of the equivalent of the Southern Bubba?
Probably. Yeah. Yes. Yankel, yeah. What are you going to do? Everyone's hashtag, we're all Yankel. So here is the deal. We typically look at others. Typically. Human beings are tempted. Let's put it in an innocent way, somewhat. To view others with the worst intentions, or assuming the worst, ascribing worst intentions. Right? Somebody says something, does something. Aha! What and we assume like devious intent, malicious intent, right? The first reaction is the worst. I know what you're doing. You're doing this because of that and the other. We build this whole narrative, and with ourselves, innocent, pure. We ascribe pure intent. No, it was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean it. Didn't know. Wasn't careful. Sorry. Won't do it again. All that stuff. We let ourselves off the hook, and we hold others to an exacting standard. And Judaism and Kabbalah teach that in truth it needs to be the opposite. For ourselves, we should hold ourselves to an exacting standard and say to ourselves, or look within and say, what is it that I'm not doing correct? What could I be doing better? What can I be changing? What can I be removing from my behavior, etc.? And we should hold the magnifying glass up to ourselves. And for the other person, ascribe the best intent. Even if somebody says something or does something harmful, hurtful to us. Okay, before I finish that sentence. Obviously, this is not justifying abusive situations and harm, etc., and criminal activity. This is not saying that the person didn't mean it or whatever. This is not justifying extreme behaviors. But the day-to-day stuff, right? Yeah, this is not the criminal stuff. But the day-to-day stuff, that's another discussion. There also might be insights that we can apply there as well, but I feel like the point might get rejected in our minds if we start moving it to the extreme or to the away from more of the everyday. In the everyday situation, we have things that people say to us and people do, and there are different ways in which we can interpret it. I can't even give it. There are countless examples that happen every single day with all of us. Right? Somebody said something, did something. And we have a choice. Do we ascribe positive intent or negative intent? Do we assume that they had the best intentions and it just didn't come out right? Or it didn't work out right? Or they intended to do the right thing and the wrong? Or do we assume the worst? This person premeditated, intended to harm me, intended to do the wrong thing, and did it, and they're terrible, and I can't believe they did that. How do we jump to that place? Or do we first start by giving a person the benefit of the doubt? And the Judaism teaches that when it comes to someone else, we need to, it says in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, it says, Havei dan et kol ha'adam lekaf zchut. A person should always judge another person on the side of favor or merit. Right? If you have two ways of looking at it, sometimes we don't even think we have two ways of looking at it. It seems to us, our first reaction is, I can't believe what they did. Okay, how many times has it happened that you assumed you knew the story, and you assumed that this person intended to do something negative and did something negative and hurt you, and you find out later, totally different story. Yeah. Totally different story. The question is, so what changed? You built this whole thing in your head. You had a whole narrative. All that you saw was the action. But what it means and why it came about, all of that was the story that you applied to it. So just like you can apply a negative story, you can apply a positive story. Right? And that's what our sages encourage us to do. We should always ascribe positive intent to another person. Again, when responsible. Obviously, in cases of there are certainly many situations where that would be devastating and that would not be a good idea to do. How do you know which case is which? Okay, life is complex, and we have to know or consult with others to know. But generally speaking, we're meant to ascribe positive intent. Susan, you had a...
I have a couple of things. The social emotional curriculum that we're using in our school has a whole chapter on positive intent.
Interesting.
And I was just thinking about some of the things that you were talking about, Jewish values that have gone viral.
Yes.
And we talked a lot about compassion and gratitude very explicitly, even though it's a public school. But this idea of positive intent, which some, I think, teachers or parents naturally, they intuitively know to have that positive intent and understand the complexities of the child's thinking. Some people don't, and they start shoulding, or they have frameworks and where they think kids should know this or that. And so you have to teach explicitly to teachers to start with positive intent.
Right.
So I think
this kid's not a bad kid.
Right.
They're not intending to be disruptive.
Right.
This is just something that they're... Right.
Like, let's look at the complexity of what's going on.
Right.
The other thing I was thinking of is that idea of separating the sin from the sinner.
Right.
And the idea of, like, we all are a spark of God, so we're looking at each other as that spark.
The positive and not the
that,
negative.
Yeah.
Right.
And that there are things that people can do wrong, and if we have to address it, because it does talk about addressing that with a person privately.
Right.
So that idea of separating the sin from the sinner.
Right. So there...
Is that what you're talking about?
There is a lot of that as well. In the next chapter, which we're not going to get to today, the next chapter, he talks about... One second. I believe it's the next chapter. Whatever. One of the subsequent chapters, he talks about rejecting somebody completely because of a negative. It's mentioned, it's alluded to in this chapter that we're doing right now, but it's said explicitly a little bit later on in one of the subsequent chapters, where a person will negate anything positive that the other person has done because of the negative. And that's where, that's a symptom of not separating what you're saying, the sin from the sinner, or the mistake from the person who made the mistake. Because we're saying that the mistake becomes the totality of that being, and swallows up everything about the person, including all of the good that they've ever done, to the point that they're reduced to nothing. There's complete, and we live in a society today where we love that. We love that. Before we got that phrase, right, it was always, right, a person is respected for whatever, and then there's a scandal, and maybe it's 100% correct, they were involved in something negative. The question is, does that negate everything positive that they've ever done? Or does it just remind us that people are complicated, and even people that have done great things can also do terrible things? There need to be consequences for the terrible things, but they also did good things. There's a subtlety there. I think people are concerned that if they give any credence to the good, or even acknowledge on any level the good that was done, it's somehow justifying the evil or the negative that was done. And the question is it so binary? Is it either or? Is it either you're a perfect tzaddik or you're pure evil? Does it have to be either or? Can it not be? Look, the Torah says, love your fellow as yourself. That becomes the guiding rule, because we all know of things that we've done that are very good, and things that we've done that are not good, that if others found out, they would be horrified on some level. Right? Yes? You don't have to shake your head, but you know what I'm talking about. Yeah? That if others found out, by the way, there was a great rabbi on his deathbed, and his students were gathered around and said, Rabbi, tell us one teaching that we should, one legacy teaching what should we be inspired with as you? I'm sure they said it in a nicer way, you know. And he said, may your fear of God be like your fear of human beings. And he said, that's it? The fear of God should only be like the fear of human beings? The Rabbi says yes. Because when a person's about to do something wrong, they look around to make sure no one else is watching. But they don't bother to think if God is watching, right? So we're afraid if stuff comes out and other people find out. But you and I know that we've done good things, tremendously good things, that maybe no one knows about. And we've all done things, not good things, that no one knows about. And the question is, how would we feel if all of the good that's known and unknown that we've done would be canceled because of things that we've done, the mistakes that we've made, or bad choices that we've made? You know, if that were... So love your fellows yourself means just like you understand for yourself that human beings are complex, that there's good and not good, that we make mistakes. Even good people make mistakes and can make big mistakes and can hurt people, right? Again, I'm not talking about extremes now. I'm talking about normative situations, right? People can hurt people intentionally and unintentionally, and even intentionally sometimes, you know, when they're not thinking in the clearest of spaces. So we should also extend that to others. Again, I'm not suggesting that we justify evil or negativity or give people a pass because of the good that they've done. But the question is the other way. Do we cancel and totally eliminate any good that a person's done because they've also made mistakes? And again, don't think of extreme examples necessarily. Think of normative examples. Okay, now, getting back to this point. Oh, by the way, you were speaking about schools.
Yes.
This is true not only with kids, it's true with teachers, and it's true with administration, and it's true with parents, right? How often do parents sometimes, in a school setting, do parents assume that the teacher, right, did such and such to their kid, or said such and such to their kid, and what it means, and therefore whatever, the whole narrative. And the parents are jumping to assumptions.
Right. I always tell my parents to always come to us with a question first. And then let's have this talk back and forth. Always ask the question.
Yep.
Don't make the statement first.
Yep.
And that's really been a good way to
Human beings,
build a relationship with the parents.
yeah, from the beginning. From the beginning, human beings have been storytellers. So we see things and we fill in the gaps with stories. When it comes to us, we put the nicest story in. When it comes, right? The best case scenario we put in for ourselves. I'm going to do it, I didn't mean to, whatever. Like we put in the best case scenario stories to fill in the gaps between the facts.
Yeah.
When it comes to others, right, imagine like a room with walls, right? There are solid walls or pillars, and then we fill in the rest with the narrative. When it comes to others, we typically put in the worst case scenario narrative for the other person. They meant this, and then that. Oh, that's why they said that. They must have meant, It's like, wow, very creative. 5 points. You get all the points for creativity, but is it right? Is it accurate?
Right.
And even if it is accurate, it's not our job necessarily. All right, let's go back. I'll start again from the last paragraph, bottom of 18. However, these assumptions cannot be made. The positive assumptions cannot be made. Sorry, not even positive. Blame assumptions cannot be made concerning another suffering. One must assume that the other person is good in every respect. One should not view others in terms of one's own experience, for one must judge every man positively and firmly believe he is surely better than oneself. Hence, here's the bottom line. Hence, one ought to be deeply distressed by the suffering of one's fellow and pray for him. Yankel, who's going through difficulty and challenges, I should not say, Yankel, no, what do you need to be doing better? Or Yankel, what haven't you been doing? It should be Yankel, I feel for you. I mean, say it with more empathy. Yankel, I feel for you, buddy. No, but with genuine empathy and care and concern and love. Okay, if one knows, this is parenthetical now, if one knows for a fact that his fellow has sinned, he should tell him so in private and admonish him for his evil deeds. Through this, he will return to God, and he will have compassion upon him and turn his anger away from him. If one does not... so that's the parenthesis. The parenthesis is, well, what if you happen to know the ankle really did something kind of terrible? You know for a fact. It's not even a narrative. You know for a fact what he did. So then you still shouldn't tell him that that's what happened or whatever. You should go to him in private. In other words, it doesn't become something where you go like, oh, Yankel, you know this guy? Let me tell you about Yankel. So you go over to him and you tell him, this is, it says admonish him. Admonish him means you try to speak to him in a way where you get to somebody and you try to help them change. And through this, the person will change, and God will then have compassion upon him and turn his anger away from him. Fine. So if that can be done, that can be done. Next, if one does not, out of the parentheses, back to the main point. If one does not commiserate, so if you don't feel empathy for the other, and even more so, if one is gratified, God forbid, by the other person's suffering, his feelings are motivated by baseless hatred. Where is it coming from? It's coming from sinat chinam, baseless hatred, which is coming from the ego, which is a symptom, or which is the experience of the klipa of midjan. So here we have again this idea, this notion that not feeling for someone else, not feeling for someone else's pain and challenge. On the contrary, not feeling their pain as your own, but on the contrary, rejoicing in that, taking again.
He had it coming.
Yeah. You know what? The previous Rabbi, who passed away in 1950, in 1927, I mentioned before, when he was arrested by the communists for his counter-revolutionary activities. So he was being, beaten or interrogated by one of the KGB officers, who told him, who was drinking, he had a cup of tea. I don't know why I felt the need to drink a cup of tea when I pointed it out. I'm questioning my own choices here. But here's a relevant point. He told the previous Rabbi that when I beat prisoners, I don't need to put sweetener in my tea. That's what he said. I don't need to put sugar or whatever it was in my tea when I'm beating a prisoner. You see, he took joy, he took pleasure in inflicting pain on others. Again, obviously, it's not to that extent, but it's a question we have to ask ourselves. Do we say, like Max said, he had it coming, deserves it, he had it coming. That guy, yeah, I understand why that's happening. And on some level, there's a satisfaction there. The comeuppance, or whatever it is. That's a sign of lack of empathy, which stems from ego. So what is the holy approach? It's love and empathy. Love is feeling a closeness to the other person. So that if a person is going through good times, then there's joy, there's rejoicing for their joy. And when that person, God forbid, is going through difficult times, there's empathy, there's pain, feeling their pain like one's own. With the difference that when it's one's own actual pain, one doesn't justify it. One looks inside and says, what can I fix? One becomes busy with the process of introspection and personal change. Whereas when it comes to someone else, one doesn't tell the other person what they need to do to fix it, or what they need to do to fix themselves, because clearly they're not doing things that they should be doing, or vice versa. But rather, one is meant to feel pure empathy and pray and do whatever they can to help the other person, but not justify their actions. Not their action, not to justify their pain and suffering. We have, this is expressed in the biblical model, where we have the greatest of the greats, Abraham, Moses, and others, who when faced with the suffering of others, or potential suffering of others, They go to bat for them. They advocate to God on the other person's behalf. After the sin of the golden calf, God says to Moses, Moses, I'm going to destroy the entire Jewish people and start again from you. Like, you're going to be the father of the new Jewish nation, and we're going to wipe this slate clean, and we're going to start again. And what does Moses say? Nope, you got to forgive the people. And if you don't, and if not, erase me from the book that you've written, i.e. from the Torah. Moses says, forgive the Jewish people. This is chapter 32, verse 32 of the book of Exodus. 32, which is Lev. Lev is heart. Lamed Bet. So Moses says, forgive the people, and if not, erase me from your book. Moses could have easily said, the Jewish people, they sinned with the golden calf. Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. God's desire to punish them makes sense. They're guilty of the crime, right? You do the crime, you do the time. That's it. No one says that anymore, do they? I don't know. Whatever. So, they're guilty. If they're guilty, consequences. Done. They should face the music. And yet, what does Moses say? They're guilty. They did the crime. Yeah, doesn't matter. Forgive them anyway. Do you understand how hard it is, this, that, the other? He justified their behavior. That's the way we need to be looking at other people. For ourselves, we look with a magnifying glass. We look critically. For others, we look with love. That is a holy place to be in. It's about looking at the other with the most positive intent and ascribing the most positive intent, and with in a sense, rose-colored glasses. For ourselves, it's a little bit different. This is holiness as opposed to midjan, which is separation and unholiness. So in the final analysis, what chapter 9 can inspire us to do this week, let's say, if we want to take some homework, is be aware of situations in which you might find yourself judging another person, whether because they're going through some challenge or because they've said or done something to you or someone else, and you find yourself judging them in the worst possible way, i.e. by ascribing negative intent. The reason why they said it or did it is because they had a maliciously negative intent. Notice, become aware of that, catch yourself, and try to flip the script. Try to ascribe positive intent. And feel, instead of the judgment and the hate toward the other or the negativity toward the other, feel the love and the empathy instead.
What did the Rabbi say to the KGB guy?
I don't know. I don't know what he said to him. I don't remember if he told him anything. I do know what he said to the KGB guy when he pulled out a gun. You see, the KGB was asking him. The previous Rebbe had set up a whole underground network of people that were facilitating Judaism, which, by the way, existed until the 90s, when communism fell formally, right? The network, the Chabad network, was still there. Today, there's still a Chabad network, but now it's above ground, and it's still complicated because Russia is complicated. But they wanted him to give up the names of all the people and how the whole operation works, and he wouldn't talk. And so one of the interrogators pulls out a revolver and says, "This toy has made many people talk." And the Rebbe said to him, "This toy only works on people that have one world and many gods. But if you have two worlds and one God, the toy doesn't work." That's what he said. I.e., he was saying, if all you have is here and now, and you can sell out to many different things, then you'll sell out and get. But if you believe that this life is only temporary, but there's another reality, right? But there's still only one purpose, one truth, then it doesn't make you talk. Ultimately, they beat him severely. He developed illnesses later on in life. He couldn't walk. He was immobile. He was in a wheelchair. They threw him down flights of stairs. I mean, they really beat him. But he survived, and he ended up resettling in Crown Heights. And the rest is history. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me today for Kabbalah and Coffee. So the moral of the story is 49ers or Chiefs? No? Neither, exactly. It's all good. I think the red team. I think the red team is going to win. The team with red in their logo is going to win. That's a safe bet. That's a good prop bet to take right there.
No one here knows what's going on. Nobody's here for the sports ball.
Apparently, right? Apparently. Okay, again, just a few reminders. Oh, and one more announcement. So, I mentioned. Actually, let me take off the